Hello and welcome to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and each show I bring to you an interesting and provocative scholar to discuss topics in social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you enjoy what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. Hey everybody, welcome to Ideas Having Sex. My name is Chris Kaufman, and today I am joined by returning guest Bryan Caplan to talk about his new book, Self-Help is Like a Vaccine, Essays on Living Better. Bryan, thank you for returning to the show.
Always a pleasure, Chris. Thank you.
So this collection, all on the theme of self-help, it's pretty wide-ranging. You've got one essay in here. You have 3 lessons for social intelligence, and they are good conversation is an exchange, be friendly, keeping friends is more important than getting your way. And those are all great lessons. But what I'm really curious about is you mentioned that you were super socially inept as a teenager. I think you've mentioned that on here as well, but that you've kind of clawed your way to, you say mediocrity, but I think you're being humble. Can you just say something about what that journey was like? And were there any specific experiences or moments that helped cement these lessons for you?
Like I said, I started off as a socially awkward teenager. I was the organizer of my group. So in some sense, I was a leader. I was always trying to go and recruit people for my Dungeons and Dragons group, which met every Saturday night, including prom night, I should say. So that'll give you an idea of where we were.
Dedication.
Yes. In terms of when I actually started learning this stuff, in high school, I actually did read Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. I didn't see anything wrong with it in terms of the arguments or conclusions. I just wasn't ready to listen. In terms of when I actually started learning more.
Wait, why do you think you weren't ready to listen?
I was just immature and, so high school kid who had the idea that he had figured out everything in the world. And so people should just shut up and listen to me.
Yeah.
Which, that was... Honestly, it's probably just my default setting. It takes work for me to not actually act on that. From the youngest age, I just remembered talking to people like they should obey, which generally doesn't work that well, as you probably have noticed, or maybe you've never tried. But if you try, people usually don't like it.
I'm guessing that I was not quite as bad in high school, but the direction of the change you're talking about sounds very familiar to me. I was probably a lot more abrasive in high school.
Yep. So possibly actually it mattered that I met a few people that had similar views, but were much more effective communicators. I think about a guy named Tom Palmer, who was at the Institute for Humane Studies when I was an undergraduate. I met him. He definitely had an impression on me where he just came across as so calm, so reasonable. Even when we were saying something that almost everyone would agree with, it'd be hard to get mad at him. I think he was a bit of a role model, but perhaps that's just some confirmation bias. Hard to really know.
Hard to remember like specifics of what you saw in him that
No, I mean like specifics. It's just as to whether he really was the causal agent or whether I'm just saying, well, I heard him and then I changed. So it was him, post hoc, ergo propter hoc. Honestly, like understanding your own autobiography isn't that easy. This is why anytime someone tells me, hey, Bryan, you know what your problem is? Like, all right, let's hear it. Like, I'm finally going to get some independent information here. Go.
Yeah, one hard thing is that aging is a big factor in a lot of changes, but it's a boring causal explanation. So it's probably tempting to want to think of something more exciting that changed the way you did things or saw things. One reason I ask about this is because you've said in the past that, I forget in what context, that you're the kind of person who often it's not slow drudging experience that changes your mind or your ways. It's like rational argument and reading something. So I was almost surprised to hear that it wasn't just like reading Dale Carnegie at a young age that kind of did it.
I mean, by the time that I reread him, I had already reinvented most of the wheel. Honestly, here's another thing that I think actually was important. The internet. Because with the internet, it suddenly is much easier to cold approach strangers. And yet you don't need to be good on your feet. You can sit around crafting the ideal email. It's learning by doing. So that's something where I actually, got practice and it's like, so what words do I need to write to get the reaction that I want out of this person? You can get a lot of practice doing that. You can write hundreds of cold emails to people, and I totally have. and then see what really works and how, what it takes to first to get any response at all, and then to get a response that you like. And then once you get a massive amount of practice, do a cold emailing strangers in a way that will get a positive response. That kind of gamifies it. And once you've gamified it, then you have improved to the point where you actually can do it on your feet face to face. So I think that in a way is, I don't think I mentioned it at all in the book, but that seems more plausible to me. And actually, I'm more confident that that's causal just because so much of it is practice like, it's game like, where it's like you try, fail, try, succeed. Like, okay, now what? Now how do I fix it? How do I punch it up, get better?
Yeah, well, that's relevant to some of your other essays in here because you have some essays on like, practical pedagogy. And I might want to jump back to this because I am really interested in what is it actually like, the experience of changing yourself and improving yourself in a basic trait like social skills. I have a hard time, remembering for myself. I feel like for me, some of the changes of improving with social skills and being less abrasive and not looking for arguments all the time was actually just learning from pain and looking back on conversations that I thought would go one way and would be an exciting argument and just turned out to feel like I upset someone and then maybe was upset myself. And then looking back with regret and thinking, how can I avoid doing that again? Just that happening dozens and dozens of times. But
I mean, another big effect of the internet for me is that when I was in high school, I was so starved for intellectual argument. I was ready to just corner people and try to get them to go and argue with me because it was just so hard to get anyone that would talk about anything other than football or whatever. Once the internet was around, it became very easy to go and have intellectual arguments. And then there's no longer this internal need to go and corner a person that isn't really on board with doing that.
It was a long, hard lesson to realize that most people hate arguing, which some people enjoy it, and even only in the best of circumstances, but some people never like it. David Friedman said that he was a teenager before he realized that there were any other forms of conversation besides argument.
Yes. What's striking is most people love complaining, but not arguing.
You want to complain with your friends about the same things. The election, such and such. Well, so you've got an essay about pedagogy talking about how you teach when you actually want someone to learn. And this is similar to what you were just saying about like kind of practice and drilling. What's your thesis in that essay? That was a little surprising to me.
Yeah, so I am a professor. I've been teaching for decades. When I grade the exams, it's clear that most people haven't learned very much. And it's like, well, how do you know? Well, even if I taught them everything they know, they hardly know anything. So I have not done very well. But motivating this essay was when I actually wanted to go and teach my sons how to take a shower or tie their shoes. And that's where I realized I didn't do any of the kind of stuff that I was doing when teaching a class. I didn't give a lecture. I instead went and was very behaviorist. And I just said, look at what I'm going to do now. Follow this, copy this exact movement, copy this. And when they would fail, I said, no, not like that. Don't go and soap your arm with one finger. Use your whole hand like a paintbrush like this. And that worked much more effectively. My sons were extremely late shoe tires. My older ones, I think they were about 12 by the time before they learned how to tie shoes. Otherwise, very advanced. And they were just so frustrated with how hard it was for them. And for them, I just said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go and do the first step. You're going to take the laces and put one over the other and pull them. And that's the lesson for tonight. And they're like, that's the lesson. And yeah. So that took like 1 minute. And they're like, okay, well, that wasn't so bad. So in general, they're like, not only was this more effective, it's avoided all of the negative feelings they had towards their many years of failure to learn how to tie their shoes. And then it's like, why don't I do this normally? I will say I'm still not doing it normally. Part of it is, it is harder to go and be a behaviorist for labor economics. A lot of it is just that the students themselves would not like it because I would involve going to them and saying, all right, you go and draw labor supply, labor demand right in front of my eyes. Come up to the board, do it. I think I would actually, if I pushed it, I would not have many students left. Or they would be just so miserable about it. But yeah, that is what you really need to do if you want to learn. Practice. I mean, it's not like that itself is that effective, but it's just so much more effective than lecturing to a person.
So in a way, it's not surprising to me at all to hear that. So that's actually my background is behaviorism, not philosophically necessarily, but like with what I do. So, you're describing teaching techniques that I've been working in for a long time. And, there's different versions and they go by different names. In the classroom, it's usually just called direct instruction with a capital D, capital I. The shoe
I mean,
tie.
isn't direct instruction more like lecturing?
That's why I said in the classroom specifically, which is probably one reason there's very little direct instruction in college level courses. Part of the reason is because it's so labor intensive to design curriculum for it. So you'd be designing all of your own lessons and curriculum for every little thing. And takes a long time. So I understand why it's maybe harder to do.
Yeah, and it's also just boring to go and for the teacher to spend all this time reteaching the basic stuff over and over again to the point where most people can do it. It's more fun to teach to the top 1 or 2 students in the class.
Yeah, this is kind of something I've always thought, working with teachers sometimes who have always seemed like it's been known in the pedagogical literature for a long time that this form of teaching, especially for more elementary subjects that have been taught and taught and taught to death for years, and there's a really clear understanding how to teach them, like elementary reading and math and stuff. But these kinds of teaching methods never really seem to catch on, and I think it's almost entirely because teachers just don't like doing it. Like effective teaching.
Well, the teachers don't like doing it, but partly because the students don't like it, so people don't like doing something people don't like.
Yes, that's part of it. I think at some level, students are more on board with it than the teachers at the lower levels. I don't know about college level, but I've observed a lot of students seem to enjoy it more than you would expect. But like effective teaching can be a job, whereas inspiring lectures are like a consumption good. It's fun to give them. Kind of get why it's not popular, but it is surprising. Have you leaned in that direction at all as a professor?
Homeschooling my kids, absolutely. Partly just, honestly, I care about my own kids more than I care about my regular students. Also, it's just more worth it to me to deal with a negative attitude because this is my kid. So it's not like it's somebody else's problem as soon as the semester ends. It's permanently my problem if they don't learn how to do arithmetic. Whereas if I was teaching other people's kids, it's like, well, someone else will fix this later on, hopefully. Then I don't have to be the bad guy. In terms of regular teaching, so the main thing that I've changed over time is just trying to raise the energy level, which at least raises the entertainment value, but also probably at least gets the students paying extra attention. The hardest class I ever taught was when I was a visiting professor at the University of Palermo, and there the students were just so checked out, so apathetic. I could barely even get eye contact with them. They're just sort of looking down at their desks, even when they're not looking at their phones. And for them, I did just keep ramping up the energy until finally I was just like a lunatic at the front of the class, using bad Italian, like just a few words, but domandi. And then I was like, who is this guy? So finally, at least I got their eyes on me. That was the best I could do there.
Do you think that in the lack of attention there was part of a language barrier, or just
a lot of it is just the culture of learning or lack thereof in at least southern Italy. Probably the whole country's education system makes even America look good.
Well, speaking of radical cultural differences, I had a question about machismo versus appeasement, one of your essays. Well, maybe first you want to say just briefly what it's about, and then I'll ask the question.
All right. Just to back up, appeasement is a word with a terrible reputation. How many times you've heard appeasement never works? All that happens when you appease is the bad people just ratchet up their demands. Sounds good, and you can name drop Hitler, but it's not true. Appeasement usually does work. It definitely works in ordinary life. Just think about all the conflicts where you've been treated unfairly just in the last week, and how often you escalated until you got the other person to say, yes, I apologize for my incredibly poor treatment of you. I'm a bad person. I will try to improve, versus just saying, all right, well, fine. Well, maybe you apologize for something where you were the victim. And notice this actually does work. It also works most of the time in international relations. Normally, a country's demands are some petty symbolic thing, and you give it to them, and then they're happy and they walk away. Giving independence to East Timor did not mean that Indonesia died a death by 1,000 cuts. There's just like this one demand, and they do it, and like, all right, then things can go back to normal. And that's, I think, actually is going on with most of international relations.
And most people will be all on board with appeasement in every case that doesn't involve their own country. Like if other countries would just appease us a little bit more. Like
Yes.
Khrushchev appeased Kennedy by taking the nukes out of
Yes.
Cuba. Great job,
Mm.
Khrushchev. Wonderful.
So normally I would say is that if it's your enemy, then it's like we're not even asking for appeasement; we're just asking for decency. If you are a neutral observer to any conflict, I think the default people have is let's find out who started it, and then tell whoever started it to back down, and the victim to go and escalate until they get what they want. If the country's weak enough, then people think, well, I guess probably that won't work, but to try it.
Yeah, I suppose I mean your adversaries. Go
Yes.
on.
Right. So anyway, there's now, by the way, of course, there is a different word that is popular, which is de-escalation. It's just appeasement by another name. Obviously, you're just trying to say, like, they are cheap, we are thrifty. They appease, we de-escalate. In any case, I say that in personal daily life, appeasement is a highly effective strategy that almost everybody uses. And if you just sat around escalating every conflict until you either got your way or it led to a total rupture of relations, you would just lose almost all your friends and associates. Now, as to why it is that people are so resistant to this idea in theory, say a lot of it is just machismo, especially for men. It's like, I'm a man, you can't push me around, I'm tough. And if I just stand up for myself and push back harder, that will get me my desired result. It's one where impulsively, of course, when someone goes and pushes you around, your impulse is to fight back. And then the question is, that doesn't mean it's going to work. So I think that's sort of the conflict. I think people are resistant to going and doing more appeasement, even though it's a highly effective social strategy, because it conflicts with their ego. And for men, there's especially the male ego. Thinking about it more is like, do women appease more? I think they probably do, probably like in most relationships other than one, so probably not with their primary partner. Then I think there's less appeasement by women, but I think
or very, very close relationships.
Yes.
So my question is, this seems clearly applicable, like in the modern world, in quote, weird societies. Does this change at all if you're talking about older societies, third world societies, and especially if you're talking about people who don't have a realistic option to escape those societies? Because if you can get to Europe or something like that, yeah, you would probably want to inculcate a different kind of culture. But if you're stuck in those, is there something functional in a different setting about the culture of machismo?
Yeah, it's a good question. In most of my observation, most of the evidence I know, you're right, it does come from Western educated, industrialized, rich, developed countries. That's where that weird acronym comes from. Possibly it's more of a backronym, I'm not sure. But anyway.
What's a backronym?
Yes. Well, pardon?
I haven't heard the term backronym.
A backronym is where you start off with a word and then you try to go and attach a meaning to it.
Oh, okay. Yes.
So if you already
hey,
let's call these societies weird, and then let's give a word for each letter of the word after the fact. That's what it would be. My guess is actually that in less developed countries, dialing down the machismo is even more effective than it is in richer countries, just because there's just so many other macho people. So when everyone else is being macho, to be the one person that is crafty and is willing to go and compromise with others, maybe that you get a lower share of every particular deal, but you also are able to go and get a lot more deals out there. And, the general idea that a big problem with poor societies is just a lack of entrepreneurial talent and a lack of the entrepreneurial mindset. And if you are willing to be the exception to the rule, you can actually do really well in those societies. I think that just makes a lot of sense. One of my main experiences in poor countries is looking at businesses and just saying, like, it would be so easy to do better here. And it's like, maybe you just don't understand what's happening in this line of business. It's like, I think if I see a restaurant catering to tourists with a bunch of misspellings on the sign, I think I know better than they do. But like, what is freaking out the tourists? Tourists not want to go to a restaurant with misspellings on the sign. It's like, what kind of a place is this? Do they wash the forks? And so to be in a society like that, to have a business-like mindset, I think actually you're going to do even better just because most people don't.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me. My guess is that if you were in a society far in the past or, a more violent society in the contemporary world and you were looking around, there's going to be variance within that society as far as who's more successful. I'm guessing you'll see some reliable character traits in the more successful people that are closer to the machismo appeasement distinction you're making.
So maybe in a true hunter-gatherer society, then appeasement would be bad because you're just stuck with this small group of people for your whole life. In that case, maybe if you appease, then you just get pushed around for your entire life. But just in a, say, modern India is very different from a hunter-gatherer society. And it's one where if you have a very business-like attitude, I think you are going to do a lot better.
So the difference being like the one shot versus just over and over again, repeat dealings with.
Yes. And especially, in an anonymous society versus where you're just dealing with a vast range of potential trading partners versus a face-to-face society where everybody knows everybody for life. That's where, of course, there does have to be a story like, well, if machismo is so dysfunctional, why did it evolve? And it's like, yeah, so in the ancestral environments, face-to-face hunter-gatherer societies, probably it did make sense back then. But just almost no modern society, even very poor ones, is remotely like a hunter-gatherer society.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like depending on the contexts in the animal kingdom, their appeasement and machismo are both common strategies you see all over the place. Not every animal.
That is an interesting point. So like in animal species where you have male combats for women, normally they are not even close to fatal. There's a sort of a butting of the antlers, and then the weaker one's like, oh my God, I'm definitely the weaker deer here. And then they backs off.
And I think even that understates it, because a lot of times that competition only takes place when the toughness is close enough that the two males can't determine just by looking at each other who's stronger. I think a lot of times the beta just backs down immediately because it's obvious he's not going to win.
Right. On the other hand, there's the issue of like even losing to the alpha may give you higher status than the other betas.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Kaufman, and I just want to let you know that each one of you are super special, precious snowflakes that I appreciate to bits for listening to my show. I love doing this show so much, but it is still a small show. And if you want to help me out a little bit, I would greatly appreciate it if you would just recommend the show to a friend, maybe two friends. But every little bit counts, especially when you are a small, new, and growing show, as I am. So if you want to help me out, that is the simplest thing you can do, and I will not bug you any longer right now. Back to the show.
You've got an essay where you talk about 10 lessons you've learned as a parent that you wrote, I think, when your older sons were 10, and you wrote a follow-up essay. Those are all great. I read them out loud with my wife. My daughter couldn't understand them, but they all seemed great. Are there lessons that you wish you would have included but didn't, or that you've learned in the meantime that are maybe more applicable to older children?
So honestly, I would have to go through the 20 lessons that I said and make sure that I didn't already say them. I do think most of my learning was on younger kids. A lot of it is once kids are older, you're not so much just training them anymore as you're just negotiating with an independent person who is coming to their own and wants to do their own thing. I've never had to deal with a difficult teenager. And my older sons were more mature at 10 than most people ever be. I did have friends who were chuckling, saying once they become teenagers, and then I said, yeah, I'm not worried. You can take those two to the bank. And that was always correct. But even my younger kids, they're not as easy, but still in the broad scheme of things, they're very easy. So, knock on wood.
How old are your younger kids?
15 and 12.
Okay. You're close to at least knowing if you're out of the woods or not.
Yeah. I mean, my 15-year-old, he's never going to cause any actual trouble. There's the issue of trying to get him to find something that he really wants to do and to work hard on it. But, he's a gentle soul. He's not going to cause any actual trouble. And he's also very cautious. So, and again, a lot of the problems you'd have with a young man, you'll never have with him. My daughter's 12. So that's always people will say, that'll be the different one. Yeah, I think we'll be okay, but hopefully.
As a parent, this is a great book, I imagine. I don't know if you've encouraged or if your kids have already read all these essays or read them long before they were published here. But
my younger kids have not read much of what I've written. My older kids have read a lot, but I don't think they've done such a deep dive back to these early pieces. Probably when they're parents, then I'll say, hey, remember how I raised you? Like, I've got a lot of good ideas, actually.
Do you think that some of them share some of your earlier social ineptitudes and that you're able to kind of jump in and fast track the lessons?
Yes, I'll say that. So my older sons, I think that dispositionally they would have been a lot like me when they were in high school, but I just steer them in a better direction. So, like, don't talk to people like that. Like, for example, some advice that I've given them is if you meet some eminent person that you disagree with, arguing with them is not a good use of your time. Ask them questions. Don't argue, ask questions. See what they say. See whether you can correctly predict what they're going to say. I mean, in general, I find this much more helpful almost all the time is, like you have to basically if you start with a bunch of questions, that's when you might say, all right, now I think that I know enough right out of your own mouth to have a productive argument with you. On the other hand, if they take umbrage at even some questions, it's like, all right, I'm not going to be able to go and push this person and find out what they really think or how they respond to something hard.
A hard thing about being a young, bright person is I feel like you probably have a romanticized image of this awesome moment of you arguing with, a professional intellectual and scoring some points, or at the very least, like making them think or having, David Friedman tells us, actually, both of the stories I'm about to relate end up with the arguing teenager losing the argument. But David Friedman has an anecdote about losing an argument to Isaiah Berlin when he was a teenager, and that being like a seminal moment in his life. And Walter Block's story of being a young kid going and railing against Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden and arguing with them. But of course, they win the argument and turn him into a lifelong libertarian. So you have some articles in here on your views on mental illness, your Zazian views on mental illness. And I'm bringing that up to preface this question, as I suspect it might be the answer, but you tell me. I'm curious, of all of your views, where do you think you get the strongest pushback from people you would normally consider to be your fans or your audience? Is it Zazian views on mental health, or is it?
Right. So by the way, I have it from Thomas Sauce's own mouth that the correct pronunciation is sauce.
Sauce.
So SZASZ in Hungarian is just like SAS, sauce.
Okay.
All right. But although strangely on his answering machine, he had a slightly different pronunciation. And I'm like, all right. But anyway, I'm going to pronounce it the way that he told me to my face. I'd say that is up there. The one where I actually get the strongest pushback is just on free will. And I've got a lot of people just saying, look, free will is absolute nonsense. I don't even know what it means. And I know what it means. It's one where it's very hard to go and get much ground, because usually they'll just say, well, like introspectively, doesn't it just seem like you have free will? And then it's like, okay, but that's an illusion. It's like, well, if we're going to just go and dismiss a constant observation as illusion, then where is the scientific method if we're just going to throw out a lot of the evidence as illusion? If you were to go and apply this to any other area of science and say, the following observations are illusory, which we know how, it's like there's some other observations that show that they're illusions. No. Yes, but I wouldn't say people get angry about free will. They definitely get angry about Thomas Sauce. A lot of what I do in these essays is say, look, what I'm saying is actually not nearly as weird as you are claiming. It's saying, look, there is a distinction between can't and want, right? Obviously, if you see that someone is doing something, then you can immediately infer that they can. But you see that someone is not doing something, you cannot legitimately infer that they can't. Maybe they just didn't want to. If someone just says, no, I disagree, and I say, I don't even know how to respond to that. Look at all the things you're not doing. You're saying that you can't do anything other than exactly what you're doing right now. You can't go to a different movie. It's like you can go to a bunch of different movies, but you didn't want to. That is what we need to keep in mind. And then what in the world does this have to do with mental illness? Well, what is the correct way to describe an alcoholic? Is it someone who can't stop drinking or someone who does not want to stop drinking? Philosophers then will say, well, they have a meta preference to stop. And it's like, all right. So you're saying that if there was some way they could bind their hands so they would not drink anymore, then they would take it. But unfortunately, real life does not offer them that option. That's your position, right? All right. Tell you what, there's a website called stick.com where you are able to make a contract where you pay large amounts of money if you do something that you say that on the meta level you don't want to do. So according to you, all we need to do to end alcoholism is to go and introduce people to this website, and then they will be happy to make the deal and they'll stop drinking because so much will be on the line. And that's where it's like, well, no. Yeah. So don't want to. It's like, then why do they keep saying that they want to change? It's like, Yeah, what would happen to them if they said, I absolutely never want to change? My favorite beverages mean more to me than my family. And the answer is whatever negative reaction you're getting from your family right now for your alcoholism would be much higher if you were that blunt. So I say they're deflecting. They're going and saying the thing that they need to say in order to reduce the punishment and the anger that people feel towards them. So I can't help myself. Of course, you matter more to me than anything in the world. I love you with all my heart, but unfortunately, my hand keeps going and pouring alcohol and putting it down my own throat.
As an economist, there's also, the distinction, and I'm sure this is whether they're thinking of it in these terms, there's the distinction between like marginal and total. And I think many alcoholics are not saying, no, it's not that I love alcohol more than you. It's just that the real comparison is this next drink I'm about to have, which is obviously no big deal versus whatever your petty complaint is or something. And, I think they're usually wrong in making that comparison, but.
Yes. And in terms of economic logic, that's actually wrong because it's the marginal drink that's the worst drink.
Well, it depends on where you are at the margin at the moment, right?
Yes. But if it's the drink that puts you over the threshold of intoxication, then that's actually the worst drink. If you just figure it's the first drink of the day that's the least harmful, and as you keep going, the drinks get worse and worse. So I would say, again, I would think of that as more of a rationalization or excuse for bad behavior by the heavy drinker than it is an actual intellectual framework that they've got.
Most of it, I think, is a lot of rationalizations. And I don't know. I think people who are in the recovery world would read you and hear a lot to obviously agree with. Because, I mean, I think
although notice that I'm directly contradicting Alcoholics Anonymous 10 steps. Because there it starts off with
12.
We must admit that we are powerless over our addiction. It's like, no, 100% wrong. How about we admit that addiction is just a name that we give to really liking something and prioritizing it over other things, and you are totally in control. And whenever you say anything else, that's the excuse. That's the bad thing.
Yeah, I think so. That's one reason I never got involved. Well, I did get involved in AA, but that I never stuck to it because there are plenty of steps that I had some objections to. But in my experience, a lot of people find clever, broad interpretations around the things that they don't technically agree with. But that was a big one for me. And I think a lot of what alcoholics who recover do is try to find whatever that button is in real life that will bind their hands in the long run so that they don't end up in a situation of temptation, which is what a lot of people do with temptation in general. Try to be away from the temptation more.
Right. Although usage of stick.com, the website has existed for 10 or 15 years, but it's not Google.
Right? Yeah. So this is where you commit yourself basically to some kind of behavioral norm and otherwise lose a bunch of money or in some cases lose it to a cause that you hate. Like maybe you're not losing $1 million, you're only losing $1,000, but it's donated to like the Trump campaign or the Harris campaign or whatever you hate.
Yes.
And then you feel just dirty about yourself afterwards. Do you think that these views, your Sussian views, do you think they're actually in conflict? Because they're very contrarian in some ways, but do you think they're actually in conflict with like mainstream empirical research, or is this primarily a conceptual philosophical disagreement?
Yeah, I think it is a conceptual philosophical disagreement. If you go and read the piece that those essays are based on, which is called The Economics of Sauce, I actually tracked down a whole lot of empirical evidence from psychology and psychiatry on how incentives actually matter. And if you give someone you give an addict who supposedly can't change stronger incentives, there's actually a pretty high rate of changing. So I think the empirical evidence, insofar as it's conceptually even relevant to people, is on my side. The main thing is this conceptual point of when you see that someone is doing something that you don't approve of, is the correct way of describing it that they can't do the better thing or that they don't want to do the better thing. And I say, it is don't want to. I think that like the real conflict actually is whether or not you're willing to say harsh, ugly truths or not. I'm saying the harsh, ugly truths. All alcoholics can change. They just don't want to. Right. And if they say, if I could press a button and no longer crave alcohol and feel happy without alcohol and also have my family like me, I want that. But that is not the relevant comparison. There you are saying, if I had a non-existent choice, I would prefer that to either of the two existing choices. It's like, that's also plausible, but it's like, If I had the choice to live forever, I would do that one, but I don't have it. So what does that show? Shows I want something that is impossible, but out of the available choices, I want the one that is socially disapproved. So that's what's going on there.
I've often described you to myself and to other people as like when I'm in the world of ideas and reading, I think the people who I most consistently agree with and exemplify like the way I want to think. I think of you, I think of Jason Brennan, I think of Mike Humer, and I wouldn't say that I disagree, but I get hung up on the Saucian view. I don't know if it's just because I'm agnostic on it or because I recognize that it's contrarian and I feel like I haven't thought about it enough. Your argument with Scott Alexander about it was really interesting to read, but it just left me going back and forth with different smart people making good points.
Right. So Scott's very smart. I've argued with him a few times. He seems to be getting very upset. I don't want to upset Scott. I don't think I had anything new to say, so there wasn't much point in continuing the argument. I think the best way of thinking about it is if you care about a person who is diagnosed as mentally ill, it is much easier just to go and say, yes, the person can't help themselves. They're not to blame. I and everyone just need to show them compassion and try to help them. It's much harder to be honest and say, I like this person, but that doesn't mean that they are a good person. It doesn't mean that they are not taking advantage of other people's goodwill, right? And obviously, in a way, it's even harder if there's a friend who is suffering as a result of, say, being close to an alcoholic. The honest thing is this person is abusing you. This person is taking advantage. They are fully capable of stopping. They have shown through their actions. Actions speak louder than words. They care more about their beverages than you. It's hard, right? But it doesn't make it false. It's still true.
It is really hard. I think you could probably emphasize, and I don't have examples right now, but there really is, even though you mentioned like some of the first step, the powerlessness over alcohol, that you're contradicting that. There is so much in like traditional recovery wisdom that is very much in line exactly with what you're saying. Because even though they say that kind of stuff, like AA, for instance, also emphasizes taking responsibility for your actions. That
so it's just like, what?
That, like,
first of all,
you
I have
did
no
bad
power.
things.
Second of all, I'm responsible.
Yeah. And I think most people who are alcoholics or, have both the experience of remembering their ridiculous lines of thinking and excuse making and remembering it, somewhat shamefully, like it's so obvious that I was just making excuses and caught up in my temptations over something so trivial, and then also get to experience being on the other end of it. Because if you're an alcoholic, you probably know other alcoholics who, once you've gotten sober, are subsequently making your life difficult in similar ways that you used to.
I mean, in a way, like the easiest way of thinking about the 10 steps is you tell them they're not responsible so that they don't immediately feel terrible. And you give them this one lifeline. And after you give them this giant lie that they're not to blame, and they're like, okay, so I'm not to blame. You like me. Okay. You care about me. It's like, and now shape up.
Yeah. And 12 steps.
12 steps. Yes.
How do you think self-help is different as an adult than it was when you were younger? Are you still taking, daily, weekly, monthly lessons or applications from the lessons you've learned over time?
Yes, I'd say that when I was a teenager, I wasn't really even trying to improve myself overall. I wasn't really conscious of it. I definitely was not doing analyses of what did I do today? What could I do better? Now, for me, it's really is a game. It's fun. Like when I'm writing an email, it's just like, all right, how can I make this email better? So that's the kind of thing that's on my mind. I mean, also just going through my head, like, what are all the things I could do that would improve things? That is something I've really internalized. So I do it a lot more. I mean, I'm actually near my lifetime maximum of just trying to make things better and just curiosity about what would work. When someone has advice, it does immediately motivate me to say, all right, so let's hear what you've got to say about how I could do something better. Like one of the main problems is just that your friends like you and usually don't think that you need to improve all that much. And so you don't learn that much from them. And then on the other hand, people that don't like you, normally you don't have that much interaction with them. If you did, then they might, if you just go to social media and to see what did my worst critics say about me, that's probably not going to be very helpful either. What you want are people that are not that close, but are still candid about what they think. those people are in quite scarce supply, actually. So that's why when I do bump into someone like that who wants to give me their impressions, I am genuinely quite curious. Anyone who
Yeah.
wants to, anyone who's in that middle category who wants to email me their impressions, I'll read them. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it's hard to do that too, especially if you're close with someone. You always risk upsetting a friendship by doing something like that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I mean, my best friendships are very candid.
that's ideal. On your recommendation, I read Men Can't Hear What Women
Oh,
Can't
yeah,
Hear What
yeah.
Men
So,
Don't
yeah.
Say.
So women can't hear what men don't say. Fantastic book, right? Don't you
Yeah,
think?
I really enjoyed it. And, one of the central lessons was that like the two hardest things to do in a relationship or in conversation is to give criticism effectively and to accept criticism gratefully. And these are
Yes.
the two things that you're
Yes.
constantly doing in a relationship and often failing at. They're
Right.
both they're both hard to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the honest answer is like, and sort of the theme of the book is that women are very comfortable going and complaining, but they are not so good at figuring out a way to share their complaints that would be effective. And men, on the other hand, most commonly, especially after they've been in a relationship for a while, are just shut down and realize, look, if I go and complain about anything, it's just going to lead to further problems and escalation. So the author, Warren Farrell, is a very perceptive guy. I remember like my older sons were just laughing at me while I was reading with this book, Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say. And they're just saying, that looks like the biggest piece of garbage. And I'm like, first of all, I understand why you would think that. That was my reaction when I first saw it. But read the book. It's really good. And it's not just a bunch of touchy-feely nonsense. It's very empirical. It's very thoughtful and perceptive. And both of them read it like, I'm like, yeah, like first twin reads, and he's like, oh, you're right. Like, this is perceptive. And they're like, yes. And then the other one's, no. And it's like, finally, like 3 out of 3 by the end. So yeah, that's just a wonderful book. And if you're listening, Warren, thank you.
Yeah, good lessons. Just to jump topics a little bit, you recently had an amazing, a video about you come onto the internet. You have a rap battle with George Borjas.
Oh, yeah.
Which was just amazing. Couldn't believe how fun that was to watch. And so,
up to about 3 million views now.
Quite an honor. You're coming on the heels of Hayek, then Mises, then Caplan. So have there been only 2 other ones prior to this, these rap battle videos?
So there's 2 Keynes versus Hayek videos, and then there's 1 Marx versus Mises video put out by my friend John Popola. If you've seen Epic Rap Battles of History, it's in the same genre. I think it's really fun. I did not write the script. The script was actually written by my good friend Glenn Whitman, who's an econ professor at Cal State Northridge, and he also has been a writer for J.J. Abrams. And then directed and produced by John Popola of Dad Saves America. But overall, so very high production values. A number of people are like, wait, is this like AI? And no, AI is not that good yet. Those are actually pro wrestlers in the video. And then they are lip syncing for professional singers.
Yeah, I can tell. Did you or George Borjas have any like consulting role in the video?
They went and just showed me the script in advance, and we chatted a bit about it. And my understanding is Borjas just didn't return their emails, so he's not involved.
Because, I mean, all of these videos, I assume, are made by and, inspired by the more libertarian end of the debates. But it seems that they were at some pains to present a realistic and faithful argument between the two perspectives.
Yeah, right. So there's a making of video, or actually there's an early making of, and there's supposed to be another making of video coming out. But anyway, in the current making of video, John Popola says that he was good friends with an illegal immigrant and showed her the video. And she came away saying, yeah, I understand why people don't like me. And people don't want me here. That would not be my reaction. But honestly, actually, let me share a related experience. I've done a lot of debates about immigration where I always take the open border side. Anytime there's before and after voting, I am always crushed. I'm always crushed. The other side just wipes the floor with me every single time. And again, why? Basically, all you need to do, even when speaking to a very left-wing college audience, is just say a few negative things about immigrants. And people are like, oh my God, I had no idea that they could go and take a job from somebody. I had no idea that they might receive more in services than they pay in taxes. I had no idea that society is kind of like a club and that they are intruding on our club. Like the level of half-baked, poorly thought out arguments that are necessary to swing an audience around on this issue is very low, which fits with my view. Like most people are just very nationalistic. People that think of themselves as far left are still nationalists first and far left second. which fits with so much of what we know about the history of national socialist movements in the literal sense. So if you are the German Social Democratic Party and World War I breaks out, are you going to side with the workers of France or with the elites of Germany? And the answer we know historically, yeah, of course you side with the elites of Germany. The one exception to this rule that I always lose immigration debates is the last debate. I finally won a vote.
I saw it. It was great.
Yes. And I believe the reason why I won the vote is that for reasons that I am still very puzzled by, whoever wrote the resolution, it was not me, made it open borders is good for humanity. And what I did is I just hammered it home and I say, look, you can complain about all of these effects on America that you want. You still have to vote for me because the harm to America, if it exists, and which I deny, but like we can just grant the point, grant all the complaints about the harms. They're rounding error compared to all of the people from India that will be taken out of poverty. You must vote yes. And I just crushed it. And my opponent, he just kept making arguments that were not even relevant to the debate resolution. And I kept saying, look, even if he's right, you have to vote for me. You must. And that insisted.
If the glove fits,
kept reminding
you must
people, like, what's the resolution? He's not even addressing the resolution. Look at what he's doing. He's saying, oh, poor Americans, they're going to have to pay another $1,000 a year in taxes. How can that compare to 1 billion people get out of extreme poverty? It can't. Benefit to humanity. That's the resolution. And all he could really say is benefit to humanity is meaningless. And like, it's not me. Like, that's a ridiculous and desperate attempt. First of all, if you really thought that you shouldn't even agree to debate me on this because you took a side, you can't take a side on a meaningless question.
Meaningless as in, not as in it's unimportant, but as in the concept is too nebulous to have meaning.
Yes. Right. And then I said, look, so world peace would benefit humanity. Is that meaningless? No, it's super meaningful. So stop. Admit I'm right.
Yeah, great debate. You guys should check that out. And all of Bryan's debates. Well, so one of the things, there's an itch that these rap videos are scratching for me that I've always lamented, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but that there doesn't seem to be a fiction genre of something that I really like, which is basically a fictional dramatization of a debate, but not one where it's, here's a movie and there are themes that go back and forth with the debate, but like, here is an actual debate and let's dress it up and make it a higher production value and more. That's been a form of entertainment for me for a long time. I've spent time just going through old chat groups that are still webbed that like of David Friedman arguing with the founder of Wikipedia, Jimmy Wales,
Yep.
There are all these.
I actually debated with Jimmy Wales too back in the mid 90s.
Yeah. A bunch of other people, but I remember enjoying his debates with Jimmy the most. They seemed the most reasonable, and a lot of other people were, yelling and being ridiculous. But I just find reading back and forth debates like that so entertaining. Watching debates, people like that. I would love to see something like that dressed up in a fictional way, but still taking the debate seriously. And these videos are scratching that for me a little bit.
I mean, the good news is there actually is a whole genre of fiction that fits your requirements, and that is the classic Russian literature novels of the 19th and 20th centuries, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. These are novels, but in with them, they actually have big philosophical debates, multi-pages. Anyone who's ever complained about Ayn Rand novels, they have these big statements, and the whole novel is there to go and show that one side is right and the other one's wrong. It's like, look, she didn't invent that genre of fiction. She is a Russian, and she is writing the kind of novels that have been praised as the best ever written from Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. I think really the main complaint about her is just that people don't like her positions. They don't like the philosophy that wins. But in terms of literary merits, I'd say that she is very much up there. She is one of the best examples of a Russian philosophical novelist.
I suspect that if the novels had the same literary merits, but she had, vaguely the position of like Dickens or something like that, they'd be much more beloved.
Yes.
But you're right.
And Dostoevsky is even more didactic than she is, really.
And I think he has maybe the merit, because I've only read the famous one, Crime and Punishment, which I loved. Yep. And it does have a lot of that. Maybe does a more thorough job of trying to capture the perspective that he doesn't agree with, than Rand does. Maybe she's more interested in showing her characters winning. But
yeah,
I don't think she does.
Because basically, like the anti-Dostoevsky character in Crime and Punishment is the main character.
Yes.
So Ayn Rand never makes her villains the main characters. So there is that.
Yeah.
And, so like in The Fountainhead, That's the one where there's a very smart, articulate villain. There's no smart, articulate villains in Atlas Shrugged, for example.
Most of them have the feeling of just being kind of pathetic and mealy-mouthed and hateable right away. It's been a while since I've read it, but that's my memory of the villains. Two more off-topic questions that I wanted to ask before we finish up.
Sounds good.
I remember you had a post recently. Well, not recently, a long time ago, but you reposted it on your Substack talking about how there's been enormous economic improvements in the last 30 years or so in the world, but no really amazing political improvements in the world since the fall of communism. What do you think about the ending of China's one-child policy as a candidate for such a development?
Yeah, that's actually a good one. I'm trying to remember. I don't think anyone said that. I mean, like the main thing there that reduces the value is that it seems that actual desired Chinese fertility is so low that it barely makes any difference. It would have made a difference earlier on.
Yeah.
But going and saying that you're now free to do
lighter.
something that hardly anybody wants to do is, it's nice. It's, it makes a marginal difference, but it's mostly symbolic.
Well, and reading about it, part of the reason it's lower might be development, but part of the reason is because the enormous propaganda campaign was successful.
Well, there's all that makes sense. And yet the main thing is all of East Asia has rock bottom fertility. So I think of it as mostly as China as just being like the other countries in East Asia. And we've got to go and think about what common features of all these societies lead them to have such low fertility. If you know my selfish reasons to have more kids, I know you know it because we talked about it.
Yes.
So one thing that all those countries exemplify is tiger parenting. So, tiger mom, dragon dad, like extremely labor intensive parenting, which makes parenting very unpleasant. They are dogmatically wedded to the idea that their kids will be failures unless they go and do everything, which means if you do have kids, then you basically make your life miserable. And this not only leads to small families, but also leads a lot of people say, I don't want to be miserable. I'll just have 0 kids and then I can keep enjoying life. So I think that's a big part of it. Also, this Richard Nenny argument that East Asians are just more conformist. He says, I think plausibly, that there's some genetic basis for this. But anyway, whatever the reason for their greater conformity, this means that in a society where you got arranged marriage, it's much easier for them to go with the flow, and then they still wind up getting married and having kids. Whereas one where the family no longer plays much role and where you've got to take individual initiative, that's hard because the conformist thing is just to keep her head down and say, look, no one will get mad at me if I don't ask anyone out. So I think they do probably have a problem with there's the conformist thing basically is not to draw attention to yourself. And the only way to go and get a date is to draw some attention to yourself. So I think that's a big problem they got too.
Okay, one more. You and Scott Horton are both prominent anti-war libertarians, and I'm sure you have plenty of overlap in terms of your substantive beliefs. I think you're temperamentally probably couldn't be more different, but I'm just curious, what do you think are any important differences you and Scott or other libertarians in that camp might have when it comes to foreign policy?
Honestly, this perhaps is embarrassing, but I'm not sure I've ever heard of Scott Horton.
Oh, okay.
What does he say?
He's just a libertarian who's made his entire career on foreign policy, primarily contemporary foreign policy journalism. He's been on the radio for a long time. He's probably one of the most prolific libertarian podcasters on the level of Tom Woods, thousands of interviews, stuff like that. But that's okay. You don't have to answer the question. If I
can just give the general statement.
Yeah, go ahead.
So like one big difference that I see between myself and most other anti-war people is I'm much more willing to admit that there's a bunch of wars that have actually improved the world. It's just true, right? So then how could you be against it? And I said, well, first of all, it's very hard to know in advance. And people say they know are just wrong. And I'm happy to go and bet them if they actually have some specific bettable claim. I think that foreign policy is one of the most corrupt intellectual fields. It's pretty much people just go and express their personalities, use vague and hyperbolic language. And then when things don't work out, they just pretend that they never said anything wrong. So I am very conscious of these problems. So I will just admit that actually it's very hard to forecast the results of a war. I think that an honest case for war would be something like this. 50% chance it makes it better, 30% chance that makes no difference, 20% chance it makes things worse. Those are good odds. You will notice that you basically have never heard any politician ever advocate a war saying something like that, which is what honesty would require, because there's just so many things that can go wrong. It's just so hard to foresee. And again, this is not just my opinion. You can see in Philip Tetlock's book, Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It? How Can We Know? people are actually really bad at forecasting international relations and what's going to happen, right? Even the highest status people, their predictive track record is quite poor. And again, if you think that you are the exception, I am totally willing to bet you if you will be specific enough to form a bet. And then it's like, well, if you're so unsure about what the effects are going to be, then why would you even be anti-war? And that's where my answer is, because I think that before you go and murder 1 million innocent people, you ought to be at a higher level of confidence than 50% better, 30% neutral, 20% worse. I think you should be able to say with confidence that there is a large excess of benefits over costs, which I think you can rarely do in the real world. I mean, I also say a big difference between me and other libertarians. So I actually call myself a pacifist rather than an isolationist. I do not hold the US government to higher standards than other countries. I'm very willing to say what I think is the obvious point, that normally any US enemy that would just abjectly surrender to the US would be better off. Germany and Japan, they were just crushed by the United States. There was mass murder, there was ethnic cleansing, there's horrible stuff. Once the war ended, those countries were put on a good track and things improved a lot. And any country that says we're afraid of the United States, I'll say, look, well, you can end it right now. Just surrender totally, abjectly, grovel, and things will be fine afterwards. Things will improve. Right now, this is one where it's like, how can you say that? Like I can say it because it's true. Now, this does not mean I'm advocating the US go and crush other societies, because almost none of them will surrender. Right? Whenever I hear someone saying we need world government in order to avoid World War III, like, no, we need World War III to have a prayer of getting world government. That's the real story. It would take World War III to get world government. So even if you're right and it would be if good once established, it is not a remedy for World War III. It is a definite, provable, demonstrable cause of World War III. And all that you could ever say for it is this is how we avoid World War IV. But like, why don't we just try to avoid World War III and maybe we'll never have it?
Yeah, what gigantic government expansions and empires have happened without warfare?
European Union, perhaps.
Yes, perhaps. Okay.
I mean, if you want to call it a big expansion, the real story is the EU does not actually do that much compared to the national governments. And most of the people who complain about how terrible the EU has been, it's like, well, your own national government did stuff 100 times worse. So why not focus on that?
Nationalism.
Nationalism, indeed.
Any recommendations for books to complement Self-Help is Like a Vaccine?
Yeah, sure. The one that we've mentioned a couple of times, Dale Carnegie's classic How to Win Friends and Influence People, is excellent. The one that you just mentioned from Warren Farrell, Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say, that one is also a wonderful book. And then actually, I think it is very good to think of this as a self-help book. Philip Tetlock's Super Forecasting. This is a book where you can help yourself become a better forecaster, which is not just for big social events. It's becoming a better forecaster of what will happen to you if you take different courses of action. So these are like the advice that he has on how to become a good forecaster. It generalizes very broadly. Now, in terms of getting the book, so like all of my other books of essays, you can get it straight from Amazon, $12 for the paperback, $9.99 for the ebook. I think it makes a great Christmas present. It's a fun book. And, so Tyler Cowen said that out of all my books of essays, this one is the most true. It's sort of a backhanded compliment, but I'll tell you, but you know what? Like, compliments are so hard to get from anyone for any reason. I'll take any compliment.
You heard it from Tyler Cowen. Well, what are your next projects you're working on?
See, I am wrapping up a book called Unbeatable, The Brutally Honest Case for Free Markets. I think we've talked about it a bit before.
Yeah.
So I think that I think I can be submitting that to a publisher in less than a year. So that one will be, I'm going to start by sending it to Princeton University Press. They are, as publishers go, they are the very best in the business from what I've seen. So I'm a big fan of what they've done for my 2 other books with them. So it's a traditional academic crossover book. So it's not a graphic novel like the last 2 things that I've done, but it's also definitely not written just for other professors. I want to get as broad of an audience for it that I can. And then I've got 2 more books of essays coming out before this project is done. So a couple of years ago, I said I was going to do 8 books of essays. I've got 6 down. I got 2 more in the pipeline, and then that project's complete.
Pro market and pro business. And what was the other one?
The other one is You Have No Right to Your Culture.
Oh, yeah.
That's essays on the human condition.
And
featuring
really
like 20 different travel essays, which are often my most favorite of my essays are just travelogues.
Awesome. And where can people find you if they want to keep up with your work?
So I blog for the Substack Bet On It. You can just do Bet On It, all one word, .ai. And then my website is bcaplan.com, and all my books are on Amazon.
My guest has been Bryan Caplan, and his book, once again, is Self-Help is Like a Vaccine, Essays on Living Better. Bryan, thanks so much for coming back to Ideas Having Sex.
My pleasure. See you later, Chris.
Thank you for listening to Ideas Having Sex, where we have stimulating conversations on social science, philosophy, history, politics, and more. If you're a fan of what I do, please take a minute to subscribe to the show and to give us a rating and review wherever you listen. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.